On August 11th, Donald Trump told reporters something that nobody in his administration had said out loud during the entire 5.5 months of this war. The U.S. has swept the Strait of Hormuz for mines, he said. The U.S. Navy has full control of the waterway. 5 months of airstrikes, a naval blockade, tanker interdictions, Hellfire missiles into smokestacks, and 13 consecutive nights of bombing. And the President of the United States was now saying, on the record, with reporters present, that the United States Navy has full control of the Strait of Hormuz. Not partial control, not contested control, full control. Of a waterway whose closure since February 28th has produced the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global energy market. Of a passage, 19 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point that 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade used to transit every day before the IRGC declared it closed. Of the body of water that Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority said on July 31st it would not issue transit permits for until the United States ends its military operations in the region. The United States Navy, according to the American president, has full control of it. Understanding what it took to get to that statement and what it means if it is accurate requires walking through the military escalation ladder that the United States has been climbing, rung by rung, since the war began in late February. The first phase was the opening air campaign, Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, the first 4 weeks. More than 850 Tomahawks fired. IRGC command posts, nuclear-adjacent facilities, naval vessels, missile storage sites, and air defense networks across the country targeted systematically. The second phase was the establishment of the naval blockade in mid-April. U.S. Navy ships and aircraft turning back commercial vessels attempting to reach Iranian ports, using Hellfire missiles to disable those that did not comply. The third phase was the reimposed blockade after the Islamabad MOU collapsed in early July, followed by the 13 consecutive nights of strikes from July 8th through July 23rd that CENTCOM described as the most sustained bombing campaign in the conflict since the opening weeks. And now, in the days since the strikes paused and resumed and the Iranian military leadership was reshuffled and the diplomatic track in Oman continued producing cautiously optimistic signals, something new has been added to the list: mine sweeping and marine boardings. The mine sweeping is the operationally significant piece of the August 11th announcement that deserves the most attention, because it describes an active military operation in the Strait that goes beyond striking Iranian targets from a distance. Iran's mine-laying capability in the Strait of Hormuz has been a central concern for American naval planners throughout this war. The IRGC Navy maintains a substantial inventory of mines, including the EM-52 rocket-propelled mine capable of targeting vessels at depths that make ordinary sweeping difficult, contact mines distributed in shipping lanes, and influence mines that respond to a vessel's acoustic, magnetic, or pressure signature. Iran used mines extensively in the tanker war of the 1980s, sowing them in the approach channels to the Gulf and hitting commercial vessels, including the supertanker Bridgeton, which struck a mine in 1987 while under U.S. Navy escort, and the American frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts, which struck an Iranian mine in 1988 and nearly sank. In the months of this war, Iran had been observed conducting mine-laying operations near the Strait, which is one of the reasons CENTCOM's July 13th strike package specifically destroyed 16 Iranian mine layers in a single night. The July 13th destruction of the mine layers degraded the capacity. The mine-sweeping Trump described on August 11th addresses the product of previous mine-laying operations that the destroyed mine layers had already completed, the mines already in the water that had been scattered by those 16 vessels before American aircraft found and sank them. Mine sweeping in an active conflict zone is not a routine naval maintenance task. It requires a combination of specialized vessels, helicopters with mine-hunting sonar systems, remotely operated underwater vehicles, and, in some cases, trained personnel in protective gear physically inspecting suspect areas. The U.S. Navy's Mine Countermeasures Force includes Avenger-class mine countermeasures ships, MH-53, Sea Dragon helicopters equipped with airborne mine countermeasure systems, and increasingly sophisticated unmanned underwater vehicles capable of detecting, identifying, and neutralizing mines without putting human divers in proximity to the threat. Conducting those operations in the Strait of Hormuz, within range of Iranian shore-based anti-ship missiles, anti-ship drones, fast attack boats, and whatever mine-laying capability the IRGC Navy retained after the July 13th strikes on its mine layers, is a mission that requires suppression of those threats before the sweeping vessels can safely operate. The American precision strikes on Iranian coastal radar systems, command posts, and coastal missile sites that preceded the mine-sweeping announcement were, on this reading, the preparation for the operation Trump described, clearing the threat environment sufficiently to allow mine-sweeping vessels to work the strait without being sitting targets for the remaining Iranian coastal defense infrastructure. The marine boarding conducted by the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit on the Wenyao, announced by CENTCOM in the days immediately before Trump's full control statement, is the other operationally significant new development. The Wen Yao, a sanctioned tanker sailing under the name Lan Jing, was boarded in the Gulf of Oman by Marines who conducted what CENTCOM called a verification boarding to ensure total compliance with the blockade. This is not the same as disabling a tanker with Hellfire missiles. This is American Marines physically boarding a vessel in international waters, taking control of it, inspecting its cargo and documentation, and determining whether it is compliant with the American-imposed blockade. It is the naval equivalent of a police stop, conducted by the force that has been described as having full control of the waterway. Verification boardings of this kind are legally complex in international law, permissible under certain conditions, including the vessel's flag state consent, existing sanctions regimes, and specific UN Security Council resolutions that may or may not apply in the current context. The legal framework under which the boarding was conducted has not been publicly specified by CENTCOM. What is publicly specified is that it happened, that Marines from the 11th MEU did it, and that it occurred in the same news cycle as the President saying the United States Navy has full control of the Strait of Hormuz. The 7 consecutive nights of strikes from July 11th through July 17th and 18 introduced a target category that had not been prominent in the earlier phases of the campaign: infrastructure connecting Iran's southern coastal cities to the rest of the country. CNN's reporting on the July 17th strikes described American precision attacks on Iranian bridges, railway junctions, and power lines connecting key coastline cities, and described what appeared to be a wider pattern by Washington, intended to seize control of the Strait of Hormuz from Tehran. Iran analyst Hamidreza Azizi, speaking to CNN, described the strategy behind the infrastructure strikes as designed to disrupt the logistics and mobility of Iranian military forces in the south. He then added a phrase that produced significant attention from defense analysts following the campaign. This could be preparation for a potential deployment of ground forces. Infrastructure strikes on bridges, rail lines, and power grids connecting coastal cities to Iran's interior do not, by themselves, constitute preparation for a ground assault. They do, however, accomplish something specific that would be essential if a ground assault were being planned. They isolate the operational area, degrading an adversary's ability to reinforce, resupply, or evacuate forces in the area where a ground operation might occur. Cutting the railway junctions that connect Bandar Abbas, Jask, and other coastal cities to the Iranian interior means that IRGC units defending those cities cannot be rapidly reinforced from central Iran. Cutting the power lines means that the command and communications infrastructure in those cities operates on backup power, which is less reliable and harder to sustain over extended periods. Cutting the road bridges constrains vehicle movement of heavy military equipment. Together, those 3 categories of infrastructure strikes produce a condition of relative isolation for the coastal military forces the United States would be contesting if it were attempting to establish physical control over the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's response to the escalation of July 11th through 17 was a warning that deserves to be taken on its own terms rather than dismissed as standard Iranian rhetoric. Mohsen Rezai, who was then serving as a military advisor to Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei before being elevated to SNSC Secretary on August 9th, warned that Iran could face a full-scale offensive in the coming days if American strikes continued through the weekend. The phrase full-scale offensive used by the senior military advisor to the Supreme Leader at the moment of the most intense American bombing campaign since February was not casual language. It described Iran's doctrinal response to what it would characterize as an attempt to physically control the Strait of Hormuz. Not targeted retaliation against specific American military assets, but a full-scale offensive involving all available IRGC military capabilities, including whatever remained of the ballistic missile arsenal after 5 months of American strikes on missile storage and launch infrastructure. Simultaneously, Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reported that Iran had threatened key ports in Persian Gulf states in response to the United States destroying a surveillance tower near the Strait of Hormuz. The threatened ports are in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the countries whose trade the Gulf depends on and whose governments have been the most diplomatically active in pushing for a ceasefire. Threatening those ports is Iran's way of telling the Gulf monarchies that the escalating American campaign against Iranian coastal infrastructure is going to cost them something too, whether they are directly involved in it or not. Operation Praying Mantis in April 1988 is the historical precedent that American naval commanders are thinking about when they describe seizing control of the Strait of Hormuz, and its details illuminate how different the current situation is from the last time the United States Navy fought the IRGC directly at sea. In April 1988, following the near sinking of the USS Samuel B. Roberts by an Iranian mine, the United States conducted a one-day naval battle against Iranian forces in the Persian Gulf that destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms being used as military command posts, sank the Iranian frigate Sahand, severely damaged the frigate Sabalan, and sank several smaller Iranian naval vessels. It was the largest American surface naval engagement since World War II. The entire action took place in a single day, April 18, 1988. The Iranian Navy, overmatched, did not attempt a sustained counteroffensive. The IRGC Navy, which at the time was a far less capable force than it has become in the intervening 38 years of investment and development, was not the primary opponent. The joint U.S.-Saudi strike on Iraqi territory is a geographic expansion of the campaign that, read alongside the mines sweeping in the Strait, the marine boardings in the Gulf of Oman, the infrastructure strikes isolating Iran's southern coastal cities, and the president's statement about full control of the Strait of Hormuz, describes a military posture that has moved substantially beyond what anyone expected when this war began. The phrase full send, in its original context, means to commit completely to a course of action without holding back. It is colloquial and American and carries a specific connotation of accepting the consequences of total commitment. Applied to what the United States military is doing in and around Iran right now, it is a reasonable summary. 7 consecutive nights of strikes in July, mine sweeping in the Strait, marine boardings of sanctioned vessels, infrastructure strikes on bridges, rail lines, and power grids, joint airstrikes with Saudi Arabia on Iraqi territory, a naval blockade enforced with Hellfire missiles, a president claiming full control of the world's most important energy waterway on August 11th. The question of what the full send has produced, and what it has not yet produced, is the one that the Oman talks, the August 9 to 10 military reshuffles in Tehran, and the August 10th compensation demand from Trump are all trying to answer from different directions simultaneously. What it has produced: a dramatic degradation of the IRGC's maritime strike capability, with 90% of Iranian missile attacks and 83% of drone attacks reduced from their day one levels per CENTCOM's own assessment. Mine-cleared channels in the Strait of Hormuz that allow some commercial vessels to transit, with 16 to 20 ships passing on the better days in late July compared to the 6 per day recorded during the July 17th peak of the bombing campaign. A cargo island with empty berths and 19 tankers waiting in the holding area because the blockade enforcement has made them afraid to approach. A $170 to $500 million per day drain on Iranian oil revenue, depending on which official estimate you use, that has been accumulating since July 31st, when operations halted at the terminal. What it has not produced: an Iranian capitulation, a formal surrender of the PGSA's authority over the Strait, a return of the Islamabad MOU's 60-day negotiating framework to anything resembling its original form, or a definitive answer to whether the Oman talks will produce a deal before the new military command structure Khamenei just put in place decides that the mandate for powerful offensive operations is the appropriate answer to mine-swept channels the United States Navy is claiming to control. The U.S. military just went full send on Iran. The response to that full send, from an institution that has now formally elevated the man wanted by Interpol for the Buenos Aires bombing and tasked him with developing readiness for powerful offensive operations, is the next chapter of a war that keeps refusing to end at anyone's predicted timeline. The logistics of what it actually takes to assert naval control of the Strait of Hormuz deserve more attention than they typically receive in coverage focused on the air campaign. The strait is 19 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, but its functional geography is more constrained than that figure suggests. International law designates specific traffic separation schemes inside the strait: a 2-mile-wide inbound lane, a 2-mile-wide outbound lane, and a 2-mile-wide separation zone between them. Most commercial shipping uses those lanes because they provide predictable passage and minimize collision risk. The Iranian military has, throughout this war, been operating in and adjacent to those lanes, using fast attack boats to approach commercial vessels, positioning mine-laying platforms in the separation zones and approach channels, and maintaining shore-based missile and radar coverage of the entire passage from both the Iranian side and the islands of Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb that Iran seized from the UAE in 1971, and that the UAE has been demanding returned since before this war began. Asserting U.S. Navy full control of the strait means operating in those same lanes, maintaining surveillance of the island's military facilities, keeping minesweepers in the approach channels, and being able to intercept, disable, or destroy any IRGC vessel that enters the shipping lanes with hostile intent. The Avenger-class minesweepers that conduct those operations are not fast or maneuverable. They are slow, specialized vessels that require protection from faster assets while they do their work. The escort and protection missions that support the minesweepers require destroyers, aviation assets, and the kind of integrated air and sea picture that American carriers and their air wings provide. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which has been the primary American naval presence in the region since before the war began, is the platform that makes full control of the strait operationally plausible rather than merely aspirational. Trump's claim that the U.S. has swept the strait for mines and the Navy has full control requires, to be taken seriously, a corresponding assessment of what Iranian capability remains to contest that control. The July 13th strikes destroyed 16 mine layers. The 7 consecutive nights of strikes targeted Iranian coastal radar, command posts, and anti-ship missile sites throughout the coastline from Bandar Abbas to Jask to Kanarak. CENTCOM's running tally of IRGC small boats destroyed in various strike packages has reached into the dozens across the months of the campaign. Iran's IRGC Navy has taken losses that have meaningfully degraded its ability to contest the Strait in the way it could on February 28th or March 4th. But degraded is not eliminated, and the infrastructure that the IRGCs has spent 4 decades building into the coastlines, the tunnels, the hardened storage, the redundant launch sites, and the distributed fast attack boat bases that spread across a long, irregular coastline is not fully visible from satellite imagery and not fully eliminatable from the air. Iran's claim that it can still close the strait if it chooses is not an empty boast. It is a statement about the residual capability that survives in the distributed, hardened, redundant infrastructure that American airstrikes have been degrading without eliminating. Whether the residual capability is sufficient to contest what Trump described as full American naval control is the military intelligence question that determines whether the claim represents accomplished reality or aggressive pressure signaling. The August 11th context in which the full control claim landed is itself significant. It arrived the morning after Iran announced its military reshuffle, elevating Vahidi and the hardliner command structure. It arrived the same day the U.S. imposed its 8th round of Iran sanctions this year. It arrived the same day Trump told reporters the U.S. would require compensation from Iran as a condition for renewed talks. It arrived while the Oman diplomatic track was reportedly progressing toward a deal expected soon. And it arrived while the PGSA's formal position remained that it would not issue transit permits until the United States ends military operations in the region. Trump's statement that the U.S. Navy has full control of the Strait of Hormuz is, in that context, both a military assessment and a negotiating position. This is the reality on the water, and the question for the Oman talks is what legal and diplomatic framework Iran is willing to accept to regularize a reality it can no longer change by force. The PGSA can continue announcing that permits are required and that it controls the strait. The U.S. Navy can continue sweeping mines and boarding vessels and escorting commercial ships through the cleared channels. The strait will be, in operational terms, under whichever authority can physically prevent the other from operating there. If Trump's claim is accurate, that is the United States. If IRGC residual capabilities remain sufficient to contest it, the PGSA's claim retains some operational meaning. The Oman talks are, among other things, an attempt to produce a legal framework that converts the operational reality into a formal agreement before the operational reality produces another round of escalation that neither side can fully afford at the current pace of munitions consumption. 6 vessels transited the strait in the 2 days around July 17th at the height of the 7-night bombing campaign, according to CNN's count. 14 commodity vessels transited on July 29th. 16 to 20 per day in late July on the better days. The U.S. Navy conducts its mine-sweeping operations and its marine boardings in the strait. Trump says full control. The PGSA says it will not issue permits. The tanker's waiting offshore from Karg Island, number 19, and declining slightly. Brent crude trades in the high 80s. The new IRGC commander-in-chief is wanted by Interpol. The Oman talks produce optimistic signals. The Saudi coalition for maritime defense is forming. The Iraqi militias threaten seismic retaliation within 72 hours. The Houthis claim attacks in the Red Sea. The mines in the strait are being swept. The compensation demand has been issued. And the U.S. military, in the most colloquial possible summary of 5.5 months of strikes, boardings, blockades, and minesweeping, has gone full send on Iran. The full send is a phrase from the extreme sports world that means committing to the most difficult version of a challenge without holding back, without checking the conditions, without planning a retreat. In wingsuit flying, it means jumping regardless of wind. In big wave surfing, it means paddling into the wave whether or not your skills match its size. Applied to geopolitics, it means accepting that the consequences of a total commitment will unfold according to their own logic once the commitment is made, and that you cannot manage those consequences from a position of partial engagement. The United States military's posture in the Strait of Hormuz on August 11th, 2026, 5.5 months into a war nobody fully planned for and nobody has fully ended, is as close to a full send as American military doctrine allows. Minesweeping in an active conflict zone. Marine boardings of sanctioned vessels in the Gulf of Oman, 7 consecutive nights of strikes on Iranian infrastructure, joint strikes with Saudi Arabia on Iranian-backed militias in a third country, and a president claiming full naval control of a strait that Iran's PGSA formally declared it controls and will not reopen until the United States ends its military operations. Both claims cannot be true simultaneously. The mine-swept channels, the boarded tankers, and the 6 to 20 vessels transiting per day in late July suggest that one of them is more true than the other right now. What that means for where this war goes next is the question that August 12th, 2026 is positioned to begin answering.